In pure mathematics, we have an incredibly brutal aesthetic/formal judgment for when something's true, right? We've got definition and proof. But here is a context where you don't have that. So instead you have to concoct something that, will serve a similar role. And Hart argues that this is what benchmarks have been for and what benchmarks have been succeeding for until relatively recently.
These deep learning models, as good as they are, they build sandcastles. And what is a sandcastle? It is a structure with too many degrees of freedom. You prod the sandcastle and it just collapses because there's no undergirding structure. And
okay, but so here's where I think that might not be exactly true.
Well, is it possible to reconcile constructivism and Platonism, right? So many folks really believe that there is actually some generating function of the universe, that it appears constructive to us. To us, it appears that there's a kaleidoscope, that there are pockets of regularities, but there's nothing that binds it together. But we like to imagine that underneath, behind
the illusion of teleology. Right.
Yeah, well, it's a bit of a Plato's cave type thing that, actually, if only, we see the shadows, but actually there is something there which is universal.
I suspect that the world is, in this sense, is like fundamentally constructive, but it has enough regularities and like the processes in it. Like the reason why they work is because they are capable of creating the illusion of an ideal. Like, I think that's why stuff works, is that it's contingent, like constructive stuff that is sufficiently regular such that like there's I think there's like a constructive process, probably like a constructive process of idealization, right, that goes on. Like, I think people in like the, theoretical biology world in the 70s were really into like, what the hell is a metabolism? And like thinking about that as kind of like an anticipatory process. Like metabolism is this chemical cycle that anticipates that stuff is going to keep coming in to run it. And so it's actually running before it gets the thing. Yeah. Right. So it's that kind of thing. So I think my vague, like, I just have a feeling about this would be, no, I don't think that there is a Platonic thing here. I think that's wrong, but I think that developing the illusions of Platonism is how structure happens in the world.
But this metabolism metaphor, I think, is beautiful because there are so many examples like that. Like the brain is a prediction machine.
Yeah.
Or the information metaphor is a wonderful one. Biologists talk about information as if it has primacy and explanatory power, and this is clearly a limitation of our cognitive horizon, right? So what we do is we view things locally, and we come up with these metaphors, these abstractions, and we understand these abstractions because they're quite macroscopic. But it feels like there's something more to it than that. If only we could have a more global understanding.
Idealization in this sense is therefore, like the plausibility of Platonism is like an excellent problem-solving strategy. Is like to invent the thing that's not there. Like it's concepts like fitness in biology, right? I think it's the right, fancy words are a posteriori or something along those lines, right? Fitness doesn't exist, but let's imagine that it is. And then if we reason about it as if fitness exists, right, it makes the story easier. It closes things down. It makes it such that there's a quantity. You can imagine there being a quantity associated to that notion that happens. Like it doesn't actually exist in the world, but and this is not even like it's not even worse than like quantum mechanics is kind of like this. But we sort of do at this point kind of like believe there's some like ontological reality to the distribution, not merely to the sampling. But for other physical processes that are totally macroscopic, like I don't believe that there's like that the distribution for a species is like essentially real. It's like, no, the sampling is real, but the abstraction of a distribution, like things act as if there were such a thing. There isn't, which makes it sort of, this is where the Platonists have a point, right? It's like, well, maybe like, what do you mean? How real does it have to be real, man? And like, maybe that it's just like, well, it, walks like a duck. Why beat around the bush? Why not just imagine that there is such a thing? I have no idea. what is the right answer? I think honestly, my sensibility with this kind of stuff is like, you want to know and think about it enough to be electrified by it, but not menaced by it.
I spoke with Maxwell Ramstead a couple of weeks ago, and he quoted a philosopher, I forget the name, but he said, reality pushes back. And is there something you think about as a category theorist? I mean, what does it mean for reality to push back when you come up with a model?
As someone trained to some extent in category theory and then spending the last year and a half working in machine learning, the way it pushes back is, I don't know how much of how useful it's going to be in the long run. I don't. I think it brings a bunch of really powerful sensibilities, but the naive applications are likely wrong. For the same reason that I think abiding obsessions with architecture are likely wrong. I think that, it could be a very useful tool for indexing the experiments that essentially find the boundaries between performant and non-performant architectures. And that's the interesting question, right? The sensibility I've got, so I can't answer the question you gave me precisely. Instead, I can sort of say, how do I feel about the whole thing now? And what's the way that I'm imagining things is, what neural networks are, at least as far as they are modeled in machines or whatever, not talking about actual brains or anything. They are an algebra for constructing parametric models such that a physics, like a stochastic process like SDG, will cause it to relax to some lowest energy state, and the parameters associated to there may be many choices of parameters associated to that lower energy state, but the model at that lowest energy state, that's the thing that computes sort of is capable of approximating the data you fed into it, right? And so what's the role for category theory in such a story is, well, it makes it relatively easy to have the idea of what the fuck do you mean by an algebra for constructing these systems? That's where it's useful, right? Is this, because you can imagine it's I've got various different kinds of algebras. I've got, wiring diagrams. Oh, that's one kind of algebra. I've got, standard algebra. I've got that, I've got various kinds of various other categorical flavors of what is meant by algebra. It's it gives you access to making it easy to formalize these things, right? And say what it means to in what ways are you allowed to build things, right? Those are all algebras to a category theorist, or a co-algebras if people are careful enough. But morally speaking, this all falls under what a category theorist would call algebra. And so that's the interesting thing here, I think. That's what we should be trying to use the category theory story for, or the tools from it for, is making it easy to index across a lot of different things to then start discovering the performance of those and sort of running those experiments. Most of my last year and a half of work has not been supremely categorical. It's instead sort of been no, I would like to be humbled. I would like to learn the accumulated wisdom of, the ML world. This is very much, a book that I've started reading and that I think is, at least for me, is likely to be one of the most important books in my work as a machine learning researcher. And this is Moritz Hart's new Emerging Science of Benchmarks. And in particular, the best thing is because, so I'll say, this is the book that if I really felt like I still had the energy and the real drive to truly understand not merely a scientific question, but the political and philosophical contingencies from which it arises, all of those, and I wanted to do that story about machine learning. I think this is the book that I would imagine I would want to write. But, the first chapter says, machine learning is essentially a synthesis of Feyerabend's notion of anything goes, right? So Feyerabend, whether I'm pronouncing the name right or wrong, is immaterial. Contemporary of Kuhn and Popper and that sort of mid-20th century, big deal about, okay, what is the scientific method? It's definitely not what we idealized it to be in the late 1800s, with Comte, et cetera, and those folks. It's something else. What is it? And Kuhn comes up with this notion of, paradigms and revolutions and all of these things. A bunch of people who are all operating on superficially compatible metaphors, but actually having deeply intuitive and kind of wild sensibilities, about what's going on. But the only thing that allows you to judge what science looks like is seriousness. And then he describes what like the character of that notion of seriousness is. But sort of you can describe this as like how science really works is, well, actually anything goes. And in some sense, machine learning has taken that mantle up seriously. It's like, I don't know what like the right aesthetic sensibility to have about what a good enough description for machine learning is. I don't think anybody does. And indeed, people are like, actually, that's the wrong question. We just don't know enough to even try that. And so in this sense, anything goes. But then you also need, well, how do you establish, if you have no aesthetic judgment for when something is true, right? I'll say this, that, in pure mathematics, we have an incredibly brutal like aesthetic/formal judgment for when something's true, right? We've got definition and proof. But here is a context where you don't have that. So instead you have to concoct something that, will, serve a similar role. And Hart argues that this is what benchmarks have been for and what benchmarks have been succeeding for until relatively recently. The example is, well, you take, one particular family of models, all for a similar task, and you take a bunch of benchmarks for that same kind of task. And while the actual numbers you get in terms of performance are different, the ranking was preserved across all of those benchmarks. But that's not the case anymore. Right. And so this is either indication that, like all of the easy stuff with models is gone, and therefore we simply shouldn't expect there to be a preservation of relative capability across benchmarks. And that's just like the wrong thing to think about. Either that or the entire approach of everything is benchmarks is broken. I haven't read deep enough into the book, but I suspect Hart's premise Hart is going to go for, I think only going on benchmarks is broken. And we need to sort of establish at least higher order aesthetic sensibilities of what an adequate argument for why something works is. Yeah. And like that's the kind of place where I'm hoping to like be operating in this space. Like the thing that, I've learned over the last year and a half, the thing that motivates me is telling a story about why that I believe. Right, not merely telling a compelling story about why, but like I just want to I've tried to be motivated by lots of different things. I'm in a business research environment, and so I try to get really excited about what this thing would do for our market position, all of that stuff. I can't maintain the excitement. The thing that I can maintain excitement for is providing an elegant and intuitive description of why something works. Yeah. Like that's the interesting thing. And so that's kind of the thing that the part of the sort of new era of machine learning that I think we have to go to, that I want to like be part of, is like figuring out what even is an adequate explanation here.
Yeah, I mean this comes back to when I spoke with Chomsky. He was joking with us. He said, I've got a scientific theory, and it's anything goes. Yeah, because he said machine learning, it's like a bulldozer. It's great for clearing the snow, but it's not a theory of science. And when I spoke with Dennett, I was asking him. He was a philosopher of science. I said, "What is science all about?" And he said, "It's creating explanations. It's generating the whys. The whys are important. And these deep learning models, as good as they are, they build sandcastles. And what is a sandcastle? It is a structure with too many degrees of freedom. You prod the sandcastle and it just collapses because there's no undergirding structure. And it's not even that there's no undergirding structure. The problem is there is every structure, right? Any possible structure is represented in the sand, and humans can guide these models to make them behave as if they have structure, but actually having every structure is the same as having no structure.
Okay, but so here's where I think that might not be exactly true. Right. And so I'm not, this is, again, a domain of the machine learning world in which I am not yet an expert, very much a neophyte. But so I was just at a structural AI conference in Shanghai, hosted by the Shanghai Qiji Institute. But he gave a talk sort of providing a statistical learning theory analysis of why chain of thought works. And in particular, I was so compelled by the story because, first of all, just in terms of what kind of thing it is, he didn't give the audience a humanist or an anthropomorphized explanation for this that says it's like, oh, well, we think more clearly, some kind of, bogus appeal to System 2. I don't believe in System 2. I think we talked about that last time. I think it's garbage.
But we'll get back to that later.
Yeah. But he was like, actually, I think that chain of thought works for the same reason that transformers work for natural language corpora, which is the following. Transformers beat the worst case predictions for how long it is going to take a particular model after a process of updating to model a distribution of sequences. It beats that time by a lot on natural language data. Why? Is because with relatively high probability, you can predict the next thing in a sequence of natural language data from relatively few things that precede it, right? So the sparse dependency that is a character of natural language, transformers are adapted to that, to quickly identifying it, and that's why they beat, the worst case predictions for how long it would take a model trained in this fashion to learn the distribution. Mm-hmm. He says that, and if you interview him, he might disagree with my characterization of his talk. That's entirely likely. But he then says, I think this is why chain of thought works, which is because chain of thought for reasoning similarly sparsifies the dependency of the formal, of the mathematical statement that you're trying to make. Is each little thing, instead of having the final answer dependent on all of the things that had to be brought into place, so you have each one sub-computations done separately. They're more secure, they're more certain, etc. So it sparsifies the dependencies to do the computation. But I was profoundly dissatisfied at the time with the epistemology of sort of complex systems work. I figured I needed to go do something like harder and more certain. And so I was like, I've got an idea. I'll go become an algebraic geometer. That didn't entirely work out, largely because this incredible thing called homotopy type theory happened during my mathematics PhD. Eventually finished up doing a PhD really in sort of combinatorial models of stable homotopy theory, which is the notion of homotopy theory that corresponds to the idea that instead of having dimension valued in the natural numbers, instead it's valued in the integers.
Academia has a long history of provocative titles to papers. So I wouldn't, and it seems like maybe clickbait culture is kind of infiltrating into paper titles even more. I mean, like a classic example is "Go To Considered Harmful" by Dijkstra, right? That was back in like '68. So you got fun things like that.
Yeah. No, I think the world of pure mathematics is significantly more, one could either call it straight-laced or paranoid that anyone will ever say something wrong. And so the fear of saying something wrong or overstating your case is so intense that people have these astoundingly boring titles for like incredible results. And so that's really the difference is, you've got these amazing titles that really sound like you're going to drop a bomb on this fucking thing. And the reality is like, this is an incremental improvement that might in fact be wrong. And you've just asserted like grand authority with the title.
Right.
So this is just part of the learning process of moving to a new discipline. And, you come in, of course, with the ideas like, oh, these people are clearly doing it wrong. And then within 6 months, you're like, okay, I kind of understand 90% of this. I think you're doing 10% of it wrong. And then after another year, you're like, mostly you're doing it right, but you could slow down here, here, and here. And maybe that's where some stuff can come in.
Yeah. Most of our viewers could understand intuitively that something like an R and N, right, is applying the literal same calculation over and over and over again in sequence. And with CNNs, it's almost like you got to think of it as a flashlight just being shined over the kind of XY, axes of an image. That's sort of the little convolution kernel there. So those types of formal constraints are simple to see and imagine, and we could think about, kind of building them into the code. But what about, just things that are much harder for humans to constrain that way? What chance is there of really, let's say, programmatically, automatically discovering? So having a set of data and then statistically seeing, there seems to be something that should be a formal constraint, and then kind of factoring that out and then enforcing it as a formal constraint. Like, do you think category theory offers tooling there?
It gives you a nice way to phrase the problem. I don't in general know how to do it, but I think it's a good question. The analogy I might make here is in a very hand-wavy sense that I don't know how to formalize, but I'm sure more sophisticated members of the machine learning community can do a better job about this than I. What should you think of a causally masked transformer doing? what does it really do? Is it's doing a parallelized approximation only n layers deep of an RNN. Right, that's really what you're doing.
That's an interesting. Has that analogy or that correspondence been pointed out before? I like it. I just want to.
I don't know if it's been pointed out, but my inspiration for thinking about it like this is really looking at like I can't remember the guy's name, but I think it's probably
it's
a
got to be
student of
Schmidt-Huber. I'm guessing. No.
I don't. No, I don't know a damn thing about Schmidt-Huber's work, but he probably was right in the 90s. Like, I'll say that. I kind of suspect that that's true.
Yeah.
But so I learned this or developed this sensibility after watching Petter actually had this really excellent talk at the graph learning workshop a couple of months ago. And like, I just absolutely loved it. You know, I told my boss, I told everyone at the company, is like, this is exactly what really good foundational ML research in a business environment looks like. Because, you know, started with the question, you know, and so I can explain, like, I mean, ask Petter exactly what was in that talk that I thought was so good, but
well, we'd love to hear your take on it too.
Yeah, no, I will. So the perspective here is that, you know, transformers are graph neural networks. And so, and that's where you get the sense where it's like, well, the causal masking, it just tells you which nodes can update which other nodes and what is the pattern of their thing. They're allowed to only do this. They're allowed to just bump things up. So essentially you're restricting the kind of functions that the RNN is allowed to interpolate. If you say that your RNN is only allowed to shift things as opposed to like bend your space in a complex way, you make that hypothesis. So none of this is formalized yet. And I might say something wrong here, and I'll just like wave my hands with that appropriate caveat. But it is in this sense, the way that in a transformer, previous things can update later on things. That is and just exclusively just by bumping them a little bit. That is very much analogous to the way that previous steps in recursion update this thing. But essentially you're just saying, instead of remembering the actual function that moves things around, you're just remembering a bunch of displacements, and you're passing displacements up the chain. And the reason why this works for sort of sparse dependencies and things like that is because you actually only need to bump it, like have the cascade of bumpings go all the way to the front a few times before you've gotten enough of it.
Right, and that's really critical, is the finite depth, because that's really the key that allows the parallelized, you know, training.
Exactly.
Yeah. Go ahead.
Yeah. Isn't that a little bit of an idealization as well? Because many of these models, we can think of them as graph neural networks, because GNNs are quite intuitive in the sense that we can think of them as information diffusers. But Petter has done some interesting work with some other folks that I interviewed at NeurIPS talking about information squashing. So even though a transformer might be an idealized version of an RNN,
yes,
as Keith was saying, with this fixed depth, it's not really the thing that we want, because you have this like information squashing problem. So RNNs, for example, when you roll them autoregressively, the information gets slowly forgotten. And transformers and GNNs have a similar form of this problem, where all of the information pathways get compressed so that it's not actually paying attention to many of the tokens in the context.
Yeah. No, right. And so Petter actually in this graph learning workshop gave a really nice discussion of this. Talks about, you think that argmax is going to save you from the oversquashing problem, but the problem, as the context window gets so large, argmax actually doesn't sharpen your distribution enough to save you. And in fact, it doesn't matter what temperature you put on the argmax, it's simply not going to do it well enough. This is where they sort of optimize expander graphs. Instead of having, anything can attend to everything before it, they use, so it's like, actually, that's too much. Let's sparsify this thing in such a way that reduces the oversquashing of the signal. And I think that's like exceptional work, because it's incredibly pragmatic. It diagnoses exactly what the question is, what the business utility is that these things are going towards bigger context length. How do you make bigger context length work? And you actually just force it in like a random way to attend to less, right? We might think that you might want some like repeating pattern of how you cut things away. And instead, I think it's actually much more that you want a very random one that doesn't constrain the optimization problem.
And they were saying there are some advantages to having a specific, like, to narrowing the cone of attention, because with reasoning you actually want to have the correct answer, and sometimes you don't.
I think the interest in them comes from the signal processing world, where they try and figure out how do you have, graphs such that, the heat equation on them behaves well, or not actually the heat equation, but sort of message passing on them behaves well as opposed to behaves poorly. And the premise, so the nice thing about their work says, okay, well, this is actually the right perspective to have about what is happening in, the sequence of updates along of a transformer, yada, yada, yada. So you want to worry about specifically about this like signal processing perspective on the thing. And so you simply say, well, these kinds of graphs that we know are better for message passing than attending to everything previously. You just substitute those in, and that you get better performance in the large context window situation, specifically because you've removed part of the oversquashing problem by simply snipping connections in a way that staggers signal.
So, Tim, you've inspired a new title that I hope somebody writes one day, which is Attention Considered Harmful. Like, we need the critical difference between the unified representations and the fractured, entangled ones is that the unified ones have kind of a sort of coherence with many more representations in their set. So, like, you can take these two unified representations and combine them and get something meaningful or interesting, or these two, like they're very composable, like across the entire set, like almost pairwise. Whereas the fractured ones, like if I take this one, I might get something, but this pair produce garbage, produce noise, that sort of thing.
Yeah. No, so yeah, exactly. This is what I'm saying. Is like it's essentially like an optimized algebra for constructing images. Right. That's the story that I think is right. That like universal algebra from a category theorist perspective kind of makes things make sense. Is you've got a very general vibe of what it means to have like an algebra for constructing things. Right. You've got so it becomes relatively easy to even say the phrase, which is like, okay, I'm optimizing over a space of combinatorial representations of things. And like specifically, I'm optimizing to make it really easy to draw pictures of the kinds of things that I originally say are important, but frankly, like what the things that people think are important are exactly the kind of things that they find easy to draw. Something that's like fascinating that I would love to connect this work with. So back when I was doing like complex systems stuff, I was reading a lot of like Stanislas Dehaene. So this will date me or whatever. So this was like what, 2000s? No. Probably 2010, 2011, this kind of thing. But Stanislas...
The global workspace theory guy.
He might be now. I remember reading a book about reading in the brain. Right. And it was about how do the pre-existing structures of the brain, how do we learn to read with them? And sort of that kind of... So that was cool. And then there was also like a work by like Chengizi in the 90s. Trying to sort of see like what kinds of things are across writing systems of the world, what kinds of intersections of lines or like bumping into of lines are allowed to be discriminatory between this symbol and this one versus which ones are not. That seems very much like the same kind of question. And so the point is we have evidence that writing systems have been adapted to being distinguished only by certain kinds of things. And that the rules for distinguishing things are like quite common. Like it's unacceptable to have this and this be different, whereas it's very acceptable to have this and this be different. I like that story. I mean, something else you might add to it is that, the human being is not, learning for the same task all the time, right? You're alternating between things that you're thinking about a lot and learning for. So I wonder if there's something of that story in there too. Is that actually part of the failure of machine learning models as they are is this legacy sensibility that they're for one thing because we think about them like machines. And in fact, the optimization process works better if you're not thinking about it like it's for one thing.
So I was just gonna say this really resonates with me about so many of the problems that you work on definitely in high school and even undergraduate, things like that. They're really contrived. It's like every every problem in your math book has a solution. You get it right or wrong when you solve it. And I got, it was a big shocker to me because when I started doing graduate work, okay,
Yeah.
literally the first interesting physical system that I modeled and then went to try and solve like had no closed form solutions,
Yeah.
And I'm just like, what the heck? I mean, how come like all these years everything had solutions and like now all of a
Oh
sudden,
my God.
like for example, I'll give you one specific example. I had this, this series I was trying to sum, okay? And I couldn't figure out how to do it, and Mathematica couldn't figure out how to do it, and I really didn't want to do it numerically, so I went to the library where they had those like Russian books, from like from like World War II era or whatever when they didn't have a lot of computers, and so
Yeah,
there's
just
these
like
massive,
books of sequences.
exactly, like these massive tomes of integrals, series, sequences, all this kind of stuff, right? So I'm flipping around. Eventually, in like tome 7 or something, I find my series, okay, and it says
Yeah.
that's the Stirling series of the second kind. Go to this other
Yeah.
book on this page for more details. Okay, awesome, yes. So
Yeah.
I go get the other book. I flip to that page. The Stirling series of the second kind is defined by the following series. The end. Nothing. There's like no more. There's just the definition of the series, right? So I go, okay, well, I couldn't solve it. Mathematica can't solve it. The Russians from the 50s couldn't solve it. Like it's hopeless. I can't solve it.
Yeah.
So the only thing I can do is just numerically
Yeah.
calculate, approximate, whatever. And I'm like, how come we didn't spend more time in any of my prior schooling learning about these techniques that you use when you don't have closed form solutions? Approximations, numerical methods, applied mathematics, basically, right?
Yeah. No, I mean, it's, what is it? Curriculum. That's the question, is like you give people the problems that they can solve such that when they finally find all the problems they can't, they're not like math is stupid. Instead, they're like math is just hard and I'm comfortable with that.
I
Right.
see.
That's
Okay.
I think that's really the reason why is you want to give, I mean,
That's
if you're
that's a good
reinforced,
explanation.
if you're not, think from a reinforcement learning perspective, why is theorem proving hard? Why has no one successfully made like an AlphaZero style theorem prover that's suddenly better than humans? It's, well, any like AlphaGo, AlphaZero works for Go. Why? Because one version of you is always winning. Right. But if you try and do the analogous thing for proof, you're almost always losing. So you have to get relatively good at even thinking about the question before you try and tackle the harder things, because otherwise you're just going to get exclusively negative stimulus and get scrambled.
Beautiful.
No, and I
That's
really
such a
like that you bring up this particular example of like all of the math problems I did as a young person, they all had nice solutions. And it's this, I remember walking home from, it was either I was in Vermont, it was in Burlington, it was my master's program. I was walking home from the bar with my friend Michael Lambert, who's now like done a lot of really great double category work. Shout out to Michael. But we were walking home from the bar, and I think this was the first time I had taught a class. And I was talking to him about just how fucking easy it is to make an unsolvable problem if you're just like randomly generating problems for your students. And he responds, cannon to the left of me and cannon to the right. The point is, it's like, no, there's just like you are walking this incredibly narrow path. As you work in mathematics, as you become more and more expert, you realize, oh, I thought I was learning all of this stuff for the first time. It's like, no, this is what everyone already knows, has known for hundreds of years. This is the walled garden where everything is clean. And like
right.
you learn how to operate and be sophisticated in this place, then you go to the bigger place where you can keep all of the knowledge you have without it totally getting lost. Right. I'm not an expert on Pavlov's work or anything like this, but I love this folksy version of the definition of Pavlov's anxiety or Pavlovian anxiety when the subject does not know whether they will be rewarded or punished for a given action.
Yeah.
Right. It's exactly that. That's the problem. Like as an educator, you can't teach students when they don't know, when they have no sense of whether the next thing they do is going to get them punished or not. right? They have no idea. That's when they can't learn. And that's when you have to back up until they know enough such that they have a really good guess for whether they're going to be punished or not. Right, yeah, that's why you have to go back to where it begins, before things go off the rails, where people are trying to learn things that they're not ready to learn. So I suspect that the same thing is true for models.
I was just gonna say, I really appreciate when you said you finally learned what category theory is, because I know I don't know like what category theory is, but I think both Tim and I, certainly me, I'm very fascinated by it, and I always think it has to have some extremely valuable insights, to offer for AI and machine learning. So it's always a joy to talk to you, because I'd love to know, what you're up to lately and what you're thinking about the application of category theory to, our field, really.
Realistically, most of what I've been doing for the last year and a half is not so much figuring out how to apply category theory, but honestly trying to catch up to what the abiding sensibilities, folk wisdom, and accumulated knowledge of machine learning is. I came from radically outside the discipline, and I really saw it as the challenge. Along with Velishkovich and Gavranovich and, Dudzik and von Glein and Arajo, we wrote the position paper that was sort of a moderately big deal last year. That's sort of how we got introduced. Last year we wrote that, but at the time I was still very much like a straight ahead category theorist, just trying to come to grips with what machine learning is actually doing, just sort of really just playing around and sort of trying to understand what it means to have, categories of parametric functions, i.e. models, and how to sort of just begin to work and think with those. But really I've put most of the last year and a half into, not really year and a half, more like a year, into just trying to come up to speed as fast as possible with, the accumulated wisdom of machine learning folks.
So that's fascinating. Can you share with us, I'm curious what some of the top few things you learned that surprised you are?
The thing that working a little bit on automated theorem proving has taught me, and just really thinking about it and going to a couple of conferences, talking to people, the thing that's really thought about is I find a renewed appreciation for my intuitionist sensibilities. You talk to a lot of people who are interested in things like structure, such as I am, and there's this abiding presumption that if you only trained on that one kind of structure, things would perform better. Whereas we know experimentally that they perform worse, right? We know that if you train a code model exclusively on one language, it is almost guaranteed to perform worse than if you train one on various languages. Exactly why is unclear. But, it's a completely reasonable hypothesis to assume that there's something about higher order regularities and sort of trimming off the specificity, the, probabilistic accumulation of a couple of syntactic things that are confused for semantics by the model. Those are stripped away by operating in various different languages. So instead, the latent representation corresponds to something closer to a higher level description of what's going on in code than, just the AST.
There has to be a connection. There has to be a connection here to category theory. Help me see it.
One thing that I would say is training on multiple languages is essentially the same, is an analog to what you do to train vision transformers, right? Where, vision transformers are not explicitly equivariant, but what you do is you do this operation of data saturation. You're just I'm just going to soup up my data set with every single rotation, translation, and transformation that I want to be equivariant with respect to. I modify the data set, and then I train the transformer on it, and that's where you get this, transformers can be trained to be more equivariant than actual convolutional neural networks. Why? As well, it's kind of disingenuous, because what you actually did is, you boosted the scale of the data set and you forced the data set to have a distribution level version of the equivariance story in it.
Right.
And then you're just leveraging the fact that the transformer is particularly good at sequence prediction. So that kind of thing. So that's the story. So the analog here, as I would say, is training on multiple languages is very much analogous to saturating a data set with respect to a group action.
Right. And so, and let me ask you this, because, and again, folks out there, please understand, I'm a complete newbie with category theory, so I'm trying to learn more about it. Wish I knew more about it. So if my questions are totally off the mark, feel free to correct them. But I've been hoping or thinking that category theory should help us to enforce in the structure of neural networks certain equivariances that we know should be there. So, for example, if we know there should be a rotation invariance or some other affine transformation, is there a way to structure the neural network where that's kind of built in as an inductive bias?
Yeah, it's actually as a formal constraint, not merely like an inductive bias where something preferentially finds solution that have that property. You can completely restrict it to have that property.
Oh, okay.
Right. And we've done that. And that's what geometric deep learning is about. And indeed, the content of the paper where we made a subtle mistake that I can sort of explain, over the next 20 minutes or whatever. That's, RNNs are an example of this. Right, is that you've got a formal constraint, which is that you're repeating exactly the same unit again and again.
Sure.
So the point being is that the wait time that corresponds to convolutional neural networks is exactly the same kind of wait time that corresponds to recursion in RNNs. And all of it is algebras for monads, right? That was sort of the story that we told in the paper. The thing that we made a mistake about in the paper, largely because, I'm a pure mathematician. I'm used to having a long time to think about something. And machine learning publications are more like you lock yourself in a room for 3 weeks and you Hail Mary. And so
remind us about the paper.
Oh, yeah. No, so the paper is this paper called Position Categorical Deep Learning as a Theory of All Architectures. I confess I objected to the title being so hubristic in a sense of theory of all architectures, but the editors were like, no, this is not forceful enough. You need to pick something that's sufficiently bombastic. And I was like, okay, I guess it's the standard of the discipline. I'm moving to a stochastic universe. I can accept that maybe it's a bit overblown, but yeah. And so in that paper, what we talked about is how the notion of monads, the notion of algebras, therefore, and demonstrating that convolutional layers are morphisms of algebras for monads, and likewise RNNs can be seen as morphisms of algebras for monads. The fact that those monads are actually the free monads on polynomial endofunctors, we made a little bit of big deal about, yada, 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 that kind of thing, but turns out that's not the easiest story, and indeed that's where some of the subtle mistake came from. I think back at the end, also through the editing process, we claimed, oh, these things are lax algebras for these things, or are lax natural transformations between these structures, and I think that's wrong. You actually don't need laxness at all. The illusion of needing laxness is because that the paraconstruction is something I don't put much faith in anymore. I think it's a accidental rigidity, and instead, some work that people at Symbolica, Salil Klingman, Mitch Buckley, and Talliers and Bainon have done, they filled in the functorial semantic story for inductive families in a neat way that made it clear that RNNs just fall out in exactly the same way as, functors on BG, where BG is the classifying category of a group valued in. So functors valued in set from BG, where BG is the classifying category of a group. That kind of story gives you sets together with a group action. Similar story where some flavor of functor valued in some other category gives you things like RNNs.
Okay.
Yeah, so that's not the best description, but the point is we made a subtle claim, and you actually don't need laxness at all, and it's actually a much more elementary story. And the reason why it was hard at the time of writing the paper is because we were working with this paraconstruction, and in particular it makes these things called colimits not work, or not necessarily work very well. And
Gotcha.
Colimits are the sort of general theory of gluing things together. And as you can believe, gluing things together is hard, and in particular, it's very hard if the presentation of things that you've got to work with is overly complicated. And I think that's what was wrong with Para.
Right. What are you most excited about and interested in? So, maybe what you're working on right now, or what you see in the field happening that you're really excited about, promising for the future, that type of thing.
Oh, the thing that I'm just really enjoying right now is, my new feeling about what am I doing? Like, what am I doing as a machine learning researcher? What are we doing with these systems overall is the following sensibility. The thing that is the most compelling is that every single story in machine learning is something about stochastic processes. And what we are doing is we are, what neural networks are is they are an algebra for constructing a machine whose or essentially like a fake physics whose energy relaxation process computes the distribution of data we fed it. Like, and just that feeling. That's what is that's the feeling, that's the vague sensibility I have that I'm most excited about.
Very
Like
cool.
I come from this world where I've got sort of like all of this formalism. Now I'm really trying to sort of just dig deep into just like, no, everything is probabilistic here. What does that mean? What does it mean to take that as seriously as possible? What does it mean to take both diffusion process as an SGD? All of these things are stochastic processes. Like all of these things are like, this is really a statistical physics story at some level, and sort of just trying to like accept that as like the most radical premise and just see like what we are doing is designing incredibly complicated versions of like the single electron of the hydrogen atom and bombarding it in some particular context and figuring out what distribution of energy states that single electron is in. It's analogous to that, except it's an extraordinarily complicated system. But nonetheless, the training process is exactly that, bombarding it with, some amount of energy in various forms and then seeing what the distribution of stuff is at the end. Like, so really
Cool.
thinking about like the task of machine learning and the sort of task of a machine learning researcher, if you're interested in foundational questions of how this works, is figuring out what an efficient language for specifying parametric families of models such that these stochastic processes like compute quickly and come up with good stories. Like that's sort of the vague sensibility I have that I'm finding exciting now.
No, thank you. I mean, I think on that beautiful and intriguing note, I think we'll leave our listeners to ponder that, and I would encourage them to do so. So listen, Paul, it's been an absolute pleasure talking with you again today, and I really appreciate you taking the time to hang out with us.
No, indeed, it's been great. It's good to see you again. It's good to see both of you again.
Wonderful. Thank you so much for coming on, Paul. I really appreciate it.
Yeah, absolutely.